Good evening. Today we are learning Parshat Tazria and Parshat Metzora, a double Torah portion. and the topic of this week's double Torah portion is spiritual impurity of people. And as an introduction, I will spend a few minutes speaking about the common impurities, the common kinds of tuma that usually happen to either a man or a woman that are mentioned in this week's double Torah portion. So the parsha starts with the impurity that happens after a lady gives birth. This is called tumat leida, the impurity after giving birth. Now, we know that a lady has an impurity when she has her monthly menstrual cycle. And the Torah says that when a lady gives birth, she also has impurity similar to the impurity of the menstrual cycle. It is not because of the menstrual cycle, and in fact, the Talmud says that whereas the menstrual cycle impurity is caused by the flow of blood, the impurity of giving birth is not caused by of the flow of blood, and therefore, even if such a thing would be possible in theory as dry birth, the Talmud speaks about such a possibility that if a lady would give birth without even a single drop of blood, she would still be impure, because this impurity is not the impurity of blood, but rather the impurity of giving birth. Now, in general, just briefly, why do people experience impurity? Where does the idea of impurity come from? And why specifically when there is a birth? Sounds strange. Birth, creation of life. Why should there be impurity? Before I address this, let's first list the impurities that this Torah portion deals with. As we said, it starts with the impurity of giving birth. It compares it to the impurity of nida. So now we have two, giving birth and nida. A lady also has a third kind of impurity, and that is called zava. The impurity, the tuma of nida, happens because of the regular monthly cycle. The tuma, the impurity of zava, happens also because of blood flow, but this time this blood flow is not regular. If a woman experiences a flow of blood at a time that she's not expecting her period, and that usually happens after the 7 days when she would expect her cycle, then she receives the status of zava. Zava in Hebrew comes from the word to flow, which means a woman that experiences unexpected flow of blood, she is considered zava. And impurity of nida and zava is a little bit different. For example, when a woman becomes a nida, she is impure for 7 days, and afterwards she can go to mikvah. This is on the Torah level. And it doesn't matter for a nida whether during those 7 days she experiences flow of blood or not, as long as at the end of the 7th day she stops her blood flow, she can go to the mikveh, and right after nightfall she is pure. Whereas for a Zava, she first has to make sure that her blood flow stopped completely, and only then she counts 7 days. That's the difference between Nida and Zava, that Zava needs 7 clean days. Now, the Jewish ladies accepted upon themselves to keep the stringency of Zava, and the sages, the rabbis, approved it, and they allowed them to keep that stringency. So now Jewish ladies wait until their blood flow finishes, and only then they go to they count 7 clean days, and only then they go to mikvah. These are 3 kinds of tuma for a lady, and they're called tumat leida, tumat nida, and tumat zava. Giving birth, whether she sees blood or not doesn't matter, just giving birth. Seeing regular monthly cycle of blood flow, menstrual blood, and an unusual blood flow, zava. A man can also have 2 kinds of impurity. One is called keri, or he becomes Baal keri, and another one is called zav. So Baal keri is seminal emission, whether it happens unknowingly, like during nocturnal emission, or if it happens because of marital relations. In both of these cases, he receives the impurity of keri, and this impurity lasts for 1 day. He waits 1 day, or during that day he goes to the mikveh, then he waits until nightfall, and he becomes pure. So as opposed to for a lady for whom the impurity lasts 7 days, for a man, Baal keri, for seminal emission, he is impure for only 1 day. As long as he goes to the mikveh that day, he is pure at night. And a man can have a second kind of impurity, which is called zav. Just like for a woman, zava is an unusual flow of blood. For a man, zav is an unusual emission. Instead of a regular seminal emission, if a man experiences an unusual emission, it's not a seminal emission, then he becomes a zav. And there are, both for zava and zav, depending how many times they see, how many days, it can be either 1 day, 2 or 7 days. But let's talk about a standard zav. He becomes impure for 7 days, and the unique law for zav is that he needs not only a mikveh, not only a pool of water, but he needs a spring of water. Water has to be coming from the ground, not only water that is assembled in a pool from rain. So Zav and Zava need spring water. Because their impurity is more severe, they need a higher level of purification. Now, someone asked the question, do men have to go to mikveh now? We know that women, at the end of their cycle, after they wait 7 clean days, they go to the mikveh. What about men? If they have a mission, do they need to go to mikveh to purify themselves? For men, since the law about the impurity of keri is only concerning the laws of Tuma and Tahara, rituals, purity and impurity, it is not obligatory for a man to go to mikveh, but it is a good idea for a man to go to mikveh, to become more pure, more spiritually uplifted. Many people do go every day or every time they experience emission, Uh, on the other hand, some go only on Fridays, and some go only before holidays, before Yamim Tovim, before the three festivals, Pesach, Shavuot, Sukkot, and Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. And some only go before Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. And that is because there is no additional prohibition for a man, even if he is impure, except for the laws of ritual, spiritual purity and impurity. And that only applies, that only has practical ramification at the time when we had Beit HaMikdash, at the time when we had to be pure to enter Beit HaMikdash, at the time if we want to eat offerings, the korbanot, or for Kohanim who used to eat teruma. Otherwise, whether a man is pure or impure doesn't matter. Whereas for a woman, in addition for her being impure spiritually, if she is nida, there is also a halachic prohibition that applies nowadays, and that is that a husband and a wife are not allowed to have marital relations or even to touch each other if the woman is nida. And therefore, women do go to the mikveh, and they're obligated to go to the mikveh, not because they need to go to the temple, to the Beit HaMikdash, but rather in order to be allowed to have marital relations with their husband. Okay, so we have covered the 5 kinds of impurity that this Torah portion is speaking about. Tumat Leida, giving birth. Tumat Nida, menstrual cycle. Tumat Zava, a woman that experiences unusual blood flow. Tumat of Bal Keri, seminal emission, and Tumat Zav, man who experiences unusual emission. Now, what is the reason that people receive the Tuma? And I'm going to address Tuma of Leida, Tuma of Nida, and Tuma of Keri, as well as Tuma of a dead body. It's not the subject of this week's Torah portion, but to answer this question, we will need that as well. What is considered the most severe kind of impurity? And that is the impurity of the dead body. And our sages say to us that whenever there is holiness, the sources of impurity cannot have access. However, when the level of holiness is lost, when Kedusha withdraws from a physical object, physical body, then in the remaining emptiness, the forces of impurity can come. And not only that, they rush to come into the empty vessel left by Kiddusha, by holiness. And they try to attach themselves to the to where once there was Kiddusha. So the greatest example is a human being that had a soul, a holy soul in his body. The neshama is pure, and therefore it pushes away the impurity. A human body, while it's alive, is the highest source of Kiddusha, of holiness. And that is why a human body, when it's in its pure state, instills fear in all animals and even spiritual beings like demons. Wherever there are people, especially if there are two people together, they form such a strong powerful source of purity and holiness, that all the demons run away. Even in a place that is uninhabited, even at night, if you have two people, all the demons run away. Usually, nighttime is the time of the um, the those that have spiritual energy but no body. We call them either angels from the good side or demons from the bad side. They can only have um, access to this world when there are no people around, either uninhabited areas outside of the city limits or at night when most people are sleeping. However, when people enter an area, if it's a single person at night or uninhabited area, then it becomes dangerous for him because this is their domain. But if two people walk even at night, even outside of city limits, uh, they are much stronger than the demons. So again, because we have neshama, a holy soul, the demons want to attach themselves to us. The sources of impurity, forces of impurity want to penetrate us, but our holy soul does not let. Only when Kiddusha, only when holiness withdraws, then they can come in. And the highest, the most severe kind of impurity can come when the human soul leaves the body completely. When a person dies, the soul separates from the body, and the most severe kind of impurity, tumat met, avi avot of tuma, the highest source of impurity, enters the human body. So the idea of impurity is that when there was holiness or potential for greatness, and that potential was removed, the forces of impurity enter. And again, the greatest example is a human body when it's alive is pure. When it leaves, it becomes the most severe impurity possible. Something similar happens to a woman who is carrying an egg that has the potential to become a baby, a human baby that can carry a human holy soul. When time comes and the egg is not fertilized, the egg becomes old, no longer viable, and it is destroyed by the body. The egg dies and is expelled from the body with blood. And the lining of the uterus is also renewed. So, because there is the loss of potential for human life, the forces of impurity attach themselves to the blood and to the woman. And that explains why nida is very severe kind of impurity, because there was a potential for human life. For a man, similarly, who experiences seminal emission, each one of the semen cells has potential, together with the egg, to produce life. And each one of the semen cells carries DNA material to create a human being. And therefore, when a man experiences emission, the forces of impurity attach themselves to the emission and to the man himself. If it's a nocturnal emission, we understand the entire potential is wasted. What about marital relations? Even in marital relations, only one semen cell can actually fertilize the egg and produce a baby. All the other millions of cells are going to be destroyed. And because of that, there is some loss of potential, even though the baby may be produced from the relations, still there is impurity. Even the woman becomes impure after marital relations, not only the man. Now, what about Zav and Zava? Since it is unusual kind of flow, both for a man and a woman, um, I don't know at this point how to fit it into this um, theory that we just described, or this rule. But for Balkeri, for Nida, and for Tumat Met, this um, rule applies that when there is holiness or potential for holiness, and that holiness or that potential for holiness is removed, tum'ah, spiritual impurity, attaches itself to that object or to the person. Now, let us go and explain what's going on in this week's Torah portion. The Parsha on page 609 of the ArtScroll Chumash says, when a woman conceives and gives birth to a male, she shall be contaminated for 7-day period with the impurity of Leida, of giving birth. And on the 8th day, when she is no longer impure, there will be Brit Milah, circumcision. So a woman that gives birth to a boy, she's impure for 7 days. On the 8th day, she can already participate in a celebration of Brit Milah because she becomes pure. And then for 33 days, she shall remain in blood of purity, which means for the next 33 days, even if she sees blood flow, she is pure because that blood is not menstrual blood. This blood is, we call it injury blood. During the giving of the birth, she experienced injury and her body is healing. And that blood is pure. So after giving birth to a boy, a woman is impure for 7 days. Then she is pure for 33 days. Even if she sees blood, that blood is pure. Together, that forms the 40 days. Some women have a custom to separate from their husbands for 40 days. And medically, that is a sound advice. The doctor would tell you to abstain from relations for 6 weeks. 6 weeks is 42 days. So it is not required. The halachic requirement is that once the woman stops seeing blood, she waits 7 clean days and then goes to the mikveh. But practically, it fits with biological medical reality that it usually does take about 40 days for a woman to heal after giving birth and to go to the mikveh. Now, that is if she gives birth to a man, to a boy. What if she gives birth to a girl? Verse 5. If she gives birth to a female, she shall be contaminated for 2 weeks. And for 66 days she shall remain in blood of purity. So for a girl, the numbers are doubled. A woman that gives birth to a boy, she remains impure for 14 days, and then she is pure for 66 days. Together, it gives you 80 days. Now, somebody asks a question, what about a miscarriage? A miscarriage that occurs after 40 days of conception creates the same impurity as birth, which means a woman who has miscarriage 40 days after conception or later, she also needs to wait 7 days if you see from the fetus that was aborted or miscarried, rather, that it's a boy, she has to wait 7 days. If from the fetus you can see that it's a girl, she has to wait 2 weeks. But if she miscarries and she doesn't look at the fetus, or the doctor doesn't show her, so because of doubt, she has to wait the longer period, the 2-week period. Now, even though a woman is considered, the blood of a woman is considered pure for 33 days for a boy or 66 days for a girl, but she still cannot enter the temple or cannot eat the offerings. After 7 or 14 days, she goes to the mikveh, at which point marital relations with her husband are permitted, but she cannot go to the Beit HaMikdash or eat offerings until she goes to mikveh second time at the end of her days of purity, which means either 40 days total for a boy or 80 days total for a girl. Now, verse 6 speaks about purification of a woman that gave birth, and she counted the proper number of days. Upon the completion of the days of her purity, for a son or a daughter, she shall bring a sheep for an elevation offering for Olah, or a young dove, and a turtle, or a turtle dove for a sin offering for Hatat. So a woman, after giving birth, is supposed to count 40 or 80 days for boy or girl, and then she goes to mikveh, and the following day she goes to the temple, the Beit HaMikdash, and brings two animals, a sheep and a dove. The sheep for Olah and the dove for Hatat. If she cannot afford the sheep, the Torah allows her to bring two doves. So instead of bringing a sheep and a dove, she just brings two doves for a poor family. Now, what about in our times? So a lady who that gives birth, she follows the same procedure. She waits until her blood stops. She waits 7 days. She goes to mikveh, and then marital relations are permitted. Since unfortunately we don't have the temple and we don't have offerings, the consequent 33 or 66 days don't apply to us. However, the obligation to bring an olah and chatat still applies. But because we don't have the temple, she cannot bring that offering. But we hope that when the temple will be rebuilt, the women will have to bring these offerings for every child. Now, we go to chapter 13, and the Torah speaks about a different kind of impurity, and that is the impurity of Tsarat that expresses itself on the skin of a person, or on a garment, or on a house. Now we go to page 611. If a person will have on his flesh a se'et, a sapachat, or baheret, different colorations of skin spotting, and it will become a tsarat affliction on the skin of flesh. Now, tsarat is a spiritual state of impurity, but the discoloration on skin is similar to leprosy. So sometimes it's referred to as leprosy, but leprosy is a physical disease, whereas tsarat is a spiritual malady that produces spotting on skin. First, there must be a verification that indeed this is a skin tsarat. So the Kohen shall look at the affliction in verse 3 on the skin of his flesh. Verse 4, if it is a white baheret on the skin of his flesh, and its appearance is not deeper than the skin, and the hair has not changed to white, it looks impure, but doesn't have all the signs of impurity. Therefore, the Kohen shall quarantine the affliction for a 7-day period. Verse 6, the Kohen shall look at it again on the 7th day, and if it did not spread, and the hair did not change its color, then the Kohen will declare him pure. However, verse 7, if the mispachat should spread on the skin, and verse 8, and the Kohen shall look, and behold, it has spread on the skin, the Kohen shall declare him contaminated. And only at that point, the person will have impurity. Even though he came into contact with people before that, they are pure. Whatever he touched before the Kohen pronounced him impure is pure. Only after the pronouncement of Kohen, the person is impure, and whatever he touches is impure. Now, we go to next page, page 613. A different shade of white that is called se'et. Before we spoke about baheret. If it is a white se'et on the skin, verse 11, the Kohen shall declare him contaminated. He doesn't need to quarantine. It's clear that he is contaminated. Now, verse 12 speaks about a case when the entire body of the person is covered with this discoloration, with tsarat. If the tsarat will erupt on the skin, and the tsarat will cover the entire skin of the affliction from his head to his feet, wherever the eyes of the Kohen can see, the Kohen will declare him pure. Surprisingly, if tsarat covers his entire body, he is pure. And our sages say that is because tsarat generally happens because of person's sins, because of his averot. And if his entire body is covered with tsarat, that's a sign that he is so far gone, he fell so low, that that's it. No rebuke will help. We leave him alone, we say, that's it. You're pure, no hope for you. And hopefully that will wake the person up. And he says, what? I'm so bad that I no hope? And that will inspire him to do teshuvah. And then, verse 14 says, on the day that healthy flesh appears in it, it shall be contaminated. And the Kohen will declare him contaminated. Now we go to another thing that can happen to a person which will be pure, and that is called inflammation that is caused by injury, and then later we'll speak about burn. Verse 18, if flesh will have had an inflammation on its skin, and it will have healed. So if on top of the wound there will be discoloration, the Kohen shall look, and behold, its appearance is lower than the skin, and the hair turned from black to white, the Kohen shall declare him contaminated. But even though the skin changed color, the Kohen will look, and it does not look lower than the skin, and the hair did not change its color, the Kohen will quarantine him for 7 days, and if it did not spread, he will be pure. Now in verse 24, we speak about a burn. If a person will have a burn from fire on his skin, and the healed skin of the burn is a white beheaded, we turn to page 615, that is streaked with red, or it is all white. If it is lower, if it appears deeper than the skin, and then Kohen will look and declare him contaminated. However, if there is no white hair and its appearance is not lower than the skin, then the Kohen will quarantine him, and then at the end of 7 days, if it did not spread, he will declare him pure. Now, in verse 29, we speak about a different kind of tsarat called netek that appears on person's beard, under the beard on the skin, or on a person's scalp under his hair. A man or woman in whom there will be an affliction on the scalp or in the beard. Beard obviously only applies to men. The Kohen will look, and if it appears deeper than the skin, and in it he will see not white hair, but golden hair, unlike the regular affliction of tsarat, the hair turns from black to white. In the netek tsarat, where it is on the skin under hair, the hair has to turn golden. Then the Kohen will declare him impure. But if Kohen looks and the appearance is not deeper than the skin, the Kohen will quarantine the person for 7 days, and if it did not spread and there is no golden hair and the appearance is not deeper than the skin, the Kohen, the person first will shave the area around the affliction, but the area of affliction he will not shave, and the Kohen will quarantine him second time to see if the affliction will spread. And if it passes the area of hair, then he will declare him impure. But if it does not spread, the Kohen shall declare him pure, and he immerses in the mikveh, and he immerses his clothing as well in the mikveh, and then he becomes pure. Now, we turn to page 617, another condition that can happen to a person called bohak. Verse 38, if a man or woman has spots in the skin of their flesh, white spots, on the skin of their flesh are dim white spots, it is bohak, it is pure. There are certain kinds of white spots. The Kohen trained in it will differentiate it from regular tsarat and declare it pure. In verse 40, we speak about boldness that a person can have on his frontal baldness or back baldness. If a man is bald at the back of his head, he is pure. If he is frontally bald, he is pure. But if on his bald head there is a discoloration, streaked with red, that is tsarat, and he is contaminated. Now, what are the rules for a person who has tsarat? That means a person who has tsarat affliction. We call him Metzora. Verse 45, the Metzora has to be isolated. The person with tsarat in whom there is affliction, his garment shall be rent. He has to tear his garments like a mourner. The hair of his head shall be unshorn, means he cannot take a haircut for as long as he has tsarat affliction. Just like a person in mourning does not take haircut. And he shall cloak himself up to his lips. He has to wear clothing that covers his whole body until his lips. And he should warn all passerbys that they should not approach him. He should say, contaminated, contaminated. Tameh, tameh. He shall dwell in isolation. His dwelling shall be outside the camp. Someone who has tsarat affliction, he cannot stay in a Jewish town. He has to go outside of the Jewish camp, outside of the Jewish town, and he has to remain by himself until he purifies himself. Now we switch to the tsarat affliction of garments, of clothing. Verse 47. If there shall be a tsarat affliction in a garment, and that can either be in a woolen garment or a linen garment, or leather clothing. Now we turn to page 619. And the affliction shall be deep green or deep red. The Kohen shall look and quarantine the affliction for 7 days. Then at the end of 7 days he will look in again, and if he again sees the affliction and it's spread, he will declare it contaminated. And they have to burn the garment of wool, linen, or leather. But if the Kohen will see that the spot, the reddish or greenish spot, did not spread, then they will wash the garment and quarantine it for another 7 days. And if he sees that the affliction is still there, I was gonna see you. If the affliction is still there, let me mute everyone. 1 second. Okay. Now, then it is contaminated and he has to burn it in fire. If, on the other hand, the affliction grew dimmer, it decreased in size, or the color is not so bright anymore, he will declare it clean. But before he declares it clean, they have to cut out the area of Tsarat, they have to immerse the garment in Mikveh, and then the garment will be pure. Verse 59, as a concluding verse for this Torah portion. This is the law of the Tsarat affliction, a garment of wool or linen, or the warp or the woof. These are different threads that are used in a loom, or any leather utensil, to declare it pure or to declare it contaminated. Now we turn to page 621 and we go to the second Torah portion of this week, Parshat Metzora. And in Parshat Metzora we speak about the purification of a person, and we will speak about the the Tsarat of houses. Now, chapter 14, verse 2. This shall be the law of Metzora on the day of his purification. Verse 3. The Kohen shall come and look, and behold, the Tsarat affliction has been healed from the Metzora. And they shall take 2 live clean birds, cedar wood, crimson thread, red thread, and hyssop. And they do the procedure described in this paragraph. And in verse 8, the person being purified shall immerse his clothing, shave off all his hair, and immerse himself in the mikvah and become pure. And then, after the whole procedure, and after immersing in the mikveh himself and the clothing, and shaving all his hair, he becomes pure and he can enter the camp, but he shall still dwell outside of his house, outside of his tent for 7 more days. First, he's outside of the town. Then he enters the town, but he has to stay for 7 days outside of his tent. Now, they have to do a second stage of purification. Verse 9. On the 7th day, he shall shave off all his hair again. His head, his beard, his eyebrows, and all the hair he shall shave off. He shall immerse his clothing, immerse his flesh in water, and become pure. And then the final third stage of purification, offerings. Page 623. On the 8th day, he shall take 2 male lambs and 1 female sheep, and fine flour mixed with oil, and additionally 1 container of oil. Verse 12. The Kohen shall take the lamb and bring it as a asham, guilt offering, with the log is a measure of oil. And then he should bring the female sheep as a sin offering, a chatat. And then in verse 20, he brings a second lamb as an elevation offering, as olah. And the flour he brings as a meal offering, mincha. And then he is atoned and becomes pure. That is the offering of a regular Metzora. However, what if the Metzora is poor? He cannot afford 2 lambs and 1 female sheep, and flour and oil. Verse 21. If he is poor, then he shall take 1 male lamb as a guilt offering, asham, and flour with oil, and 2 turtle doves. So instead of bringing 3 animals, he brings only 1 animal and 2 birds. Now turn to page 625. 1 bird shall be a sin offering and 1 elevation offering. And the Torah describes what should they do with the blood, with oil, how they apply it to his thumb, to his ear, and to his toe. Now, page 625, verse 33, we speak about the Tsarat affliction of houses. Verse 34, when you arrive in the land of Canaan, and I will place a Tsarat affliction upon a house in the land of your possession, which means the Tsarat of houses can only happen in the land of Israel. The Kohen again comes, page 627, verse 36, and they shall clear the house before the Kohen comes to look at the affliction, because until the Kohen comes, everything is pure. Once the Kohen comes and looks and he says tameh, everything inside the house will be impure. So in order to save the utensils, that they shouldn't become impure, they remove them from the house before Kohen comes. Verse 37, the Kohen shall look at the affliction. Behold, the affliction is in the walls of the house. Depressions, deep green or deep red, and the appearance is lower than the wall. So just like a garment, the affliction is red or green, unlike a skin of a human being, which is white. Verse 38, the Kohen shall exit from the house, and he shall quarantine the house for a 7-day period. The Kohen shall return on the 7th day, and if the affliction had spread, the Kohen shall command, and they shall remove the stones that contain the affliction. They take out the stones from the house. It applies only to houses that are made from stones. And they take them outside of the city and throw them in an impure place. And then they scrape the entire house on the inside, all around. They remove the plaster from the inside the house, and they bring the plaster, the mortar, to the outside of the city as well. And they bring new stones to replace, instead of the contaminated stones. They connect them, and they cover the house again with fresh mortar, fresh plaster. Verse 43, if the affliction returns and erupts in the house after removal of stones and mortar, verse 44, then the Kohen shall come and look, and behold, the affliction had spread in the house. Verse 45, he shall demolish the house, its stone and its wood and its mortar, and they shall take everything to the outside of the city, to an impure place. And of course, if the affliction had not spread, verse 48 says, then the Kohen shall declare the house pure. Now, before that, in verse 46, Torah tells us what happens to a house when it's impure. Anyone who enters the house during all the days of quarantine shall become contaminated until the evening. The person who enters the house that has Tsarat becomes impure. Let me mute everyone again. Okay, thank you. Now, a person who enters the house when the house is quarantined becomes impure for 1 day. However, if the person spends time in the house, about 2 minutes, a time that it takes to eat a small meal, then he has to also immerse in the mikvah together with his garments. The garments also have to go to mikvah. Okay, now we're on page 629. How do we purify the house that used to have tsarat? Verse 49. To purify the house, he shall take 2 birds, cedar wood, red thread, and hyssop. And they do a procedure with killing one bird, taking its blood, dipping the other blood and the other ingredients, sending the bird away, sprinkling the blood on the house, and then the house becomes purified. Verse 54. This is the law for every Tsarat affliction, and the netek, and Tsarat of garments, and of houses, and se'et and sapachet and baheret, to rule on which day it is contaminated and on which day it is purified. This is the law of Tsarat. Now we finished with the laws of Tsarat, and in chapter 15 we speak about other impurities that we mentioned at the beginning of today's class. First is the law of Zav. Any man who will have a discharge from his flesh, his discharge is contaminated. Verse 4, any bedding upon which the person with the discharge will recline shall be contaminated. And verse 5, a person who will touch his bedding shall immerse his garments and immerse himself in water, and he remains contaminated until the evening. So not only Zav himself is tameh, but also anything the Zav touches is tameh. And if the Zav sits on a bed, a chair, a bench, then that object upon which he sits becomes impure. So much so that if another person touches the object, this seat of the Zav, that other person will become tameh, impure for 1 day. Then on page 631, for the remaining of the paragraph, the Torah speaks about other laws of impurity of Zav. And in verse 13, we speak about purification of Zav. When the man with the discharge ceases to discharge, he shall count for himself 7 days from his cessation, 7 clean days, immerse his garments in Mikvah, and immerse his flesh in spring water. Here's the difference between Zav and other kinds of impurity, that for Zav you need spring water. The water that comes out actively from underground. And then he becomes purified. But then on the 8th day, he has to bring offerings. He takes 2 turtle doves or 2 doves. Verse 15, the Kohen shall make them, one as a sin offering as Hatat, and one as elevation offering as Olah. And then he becomes pure. The next kind of impurity is Baal Keri, a man who sees a seminal discharge. Verse 16, a man from whom there is a discharge of semen shall immerse his entire flesh in water and remain contaminated until evening. So a man who has a discharge or has relations with a woman, he and the woman have to clean themselves and go to the mikveh, and then after nightfall they become pure. In verse 19 we speak about the next kind of impurity of nida. When a woman has a discharge, her discharge from her flesh being blood, she shall be in her state of separation for a 7-day period. This is the normal blood flow of a woman who experiences menstrual cycle. Anyone who touches her shall remain contaminated until the evening. So the woman who is nida herself, she's impure for 7 days. If anyone touches her, they become impure for 1 day. And anything she touches becomes impure. If she sits on a chair, bed, or a bench, they become impure. And a man that touches that sinning object for sinning, becomes impure as well. Now, verse 24 speaks about what if a man has forbidden relations with a nida. If a man lies with her, in addition to being a prohibition, a severe prohibition that carries a karet, spiritual excision punishment, the man also becomes impure, and her state of nida will be upon him, and he becomes contaminated for 7-day period. If a man just touches a nida, he becomes impure for 1 day. But if a man has relations with a nida, he becomes impure for 7-day period. Even if it is her last day of being a nida, and she goes to the mikveh and becomes pure the next day, the man remains a nida for 7-day period. So this is a surprising law, that a man can also have a state of nida if he has forbidden relations with a nida. Now, someone is asking a question: what about a woman who cooks for family and takes care of kids? Everything is contaminated? And the answer is yes, but that's not a problem because we are all contaminated anyway. We are not concerned about spiritual contamination anymore. The reason why a woman goes to mikveh, as I said at the beginning of this class, is because there is a prohibition for her to be with her husband as long as she's nida. So she's going to the mikveh in order to become permitted to her husband, not because she wants to become pure. She will become pure, but that's not the reason for her to go. That is why women that are unmarried don't go to the mikveh, even though they do experience menstruation. They don't need to go to mikveh, and their fathers and um, siblings, mothers, sisters can touch them, no problem, even though they will become impure. That's not prohibited to become impure. What's prohibited is only the relations between a man and a woman who is nida. Now, we go to the final kind of impurity of zava, verse 25. If a woman's blood flows for many days outside of her period of separation, which means she experiences an unusual flow of blood, then she becomes contaminated. She is zava. And she is zava um, until she stops seeing blood and she counts 7 clean days. As the verse 28 says, if she ceases her flow, she must count 7 days for herself, and afterwards she can be purified. How? Page 635, verse 29. On the 8th day, which means after going to the mikveh, become purified the next day, she shall take for herself 2 turtle doves or 2 young doves, and shall bring them to the temple. The Kohen shall make one as a sin offering chatat, and one as elevation offering olah. Now we go to verse 31, and this summarizes and concludes these 2 Torah portions. You shall separate the children of Israel from their contamination, and they shall not die as a result of their contamination, if they contaminate my temple that is among them. This is the law of the man with a discharge, and from whom there is a seminal discharge, through which he becomes contaminated. And concerning a woman who suffers through her separation, and concerning a person who has a flow, whether a male or a female, and concerning a man who lies with a contaminated woman. With this, we conclude Parshat Tazria and Parshat Metzora. Thank you for listening. Shabbat Shalom.